On this channel, we've talked a lot about the Azusa Street Revival, some of the people involved, and its influence over the spread of the Pentecostal movement throughout the modern times. But what if I were to tell you that there was a revival that took place completely separate from Azusa, before Azusa? That is the reason why we get such influential Pentecostals, such as Smith Wigglesworth. I'm Jay Kennedy, and today in Pentecostal history, join me as we discuss and learn about the Welsh Revival. Now, Wales had experienced some great revivals, and in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they had been inspired by such great preachers as Christmas Evans, John Elias, and Henry Rees. Christmas Evans lived from 1766 to 1838. He was a Welsh Baptist minister, considered the greatest preacher the Baptists ever had in Great Britain. He was influenced by Calvinistic Methodists and Baptists, and he was famous for his well laid out sermons and Sunday school ministry. John Elias lived from 1744 to 1841. He was a Methodist preacher that took part in the Welsh Methodist revival of the first part of the 1800s. He was also known for his strong preaching. It was said that it sounded as if he was talking fire down from heaven. Henry Rees lived from 1798 to 1869. He was a Welsh Calvinist Methodist preacher. His father was also a Calvinistic Methodist, and he was also known for his fiery, strong preaching. Those three men led the great revivals of the 1700s. Although that revival had been largely Calvinistic, after the 1850s, the Calvinistic Methodists began to lose their influence. There would be some smaller revivals between 1859 and 1904, but those were largely regional and not national. Now, elsewhere in the world, revival was beginning to happen. The holiness movement was in full swing in the United States. Charles Parham had started his ministry in Topeka, Kansas. A revival broke out among the South African Boers who were captured by the British in 1900 during the war, and they would bring that revival back with them to South Africa in 1902. A revival started in Japan in 1900, which would double the size of Japan's small church. In 1902, 8,000 people would be converted to Christianity through revival. The two men who led that revival, R.A. Torrey, who was a student of D.L. Moody, and Charles Alexander, a choir director, went to Great Britain, and they ended up in Wales in 1904. They had a poor response to their preaching, so they called for a time of prayer and fasting. Torrey reported that on the day of prayer and fasting, a young man named Evan Roberts received an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. This would be the day, September 22nd, 1904, the revival would begin. Evan Roberts was the son of a coal miner. His family was Calvinistic Methodist. He joined his father in the mines at the age of 13. At that early age, he had a hunger and a fire for God. He would memorize verses from the Bible. He attended Moriah Chapel, and he said he felt a strong call on his life from God. There was an old deacon in the church that was a strong influence on him. He taught him to remember Thomas and not to be absent so that he didn't miss the moves of God. So he taught him to go to church. Make sure you're in church. For years, with a strict routine of prayer, fasting, attending services, he interceded for a revival in Wales. He would eventually connect with Sidney Evans, who would become one of his associates in the revival. In 1904, in a meeting held by Seth Joshua, who was considered the most powerful preacher in Wales at the time, he had a deep experience. The evangelist prayed, "Lord, bend us." And he said he felt the Spirit tell him, "This is what you need." The next day at the chapel meeting, he had that deep experience, and he would later write about it and say this: "I felt a living power pervading my bosom. It took my breath away, and my legs trembled exceedingly. My face was bathed in perspiration, and the tears flowed in streams. I cried out, 'Bend me, bend me.' It was God's commending love that bent me. Following that, the salvation of the human soul was solemnly impressed on me. I felt ablaze with the desire to go through the length and breadth of Wales to tell of the Savior. 9 months after that experience, he was still having visions from God. He began to hold meetings. At first, people were resistant, but then 6 people would be converted. He prayed for more. He said 6 was not enough, we need more. And more came. The numbers steadily grew, and people were giving their hearts to God. Now, these revival meetings were strange because none of them were planned. Roberts never set up places to go. He followed the Spirit. Where the Spirit told him to go, that's where he went. Oftentimes at these meetings, he wouldn't even preach. They would open up with strong intercession. There was spontaneous prayer, testimonies, confessions. One of the things that they did most was sing. They sung hymns. They sung hymns with all their heart, and that oftentimes moved the entire crowd. Roberts and his workers would pray for those who were spiritually in distress. The Spirit flowed freely, and many people were being filled. Now, oftentimes these meetings would go well into the early hours of the morning. So Roberts and his workers would work all the way to the morning. They'd go home, get 2 or 3 hours of sleep, and then be back up to work again at 5 o'clock in the morning to preach to the miners. Now, although this revival had started in South Wales, soon the revival fire would be burning even in the north. Now, as the revival was happening, the country began to show signs of national change. The miners, known for their vulgarity and debauchery, began to clean up their act. They stopped cursing. They were attending services. Their work productivity began to go up. The workers took better care of their boss's property. The revival affected the court systems. There were multiple towns where their jails were empty. The judges and magistrates complained about not having anything to do. Their dockets got light. Sometimes they had no one to judge at all. Prison wardens complained that their guards had nothing to do. They sat around twiddling their thumbs because the jails and the prisons were empty. The judges were given white gloves to commemorate this occasion because it was strange to them. Now, one of the funniest and biggest examples of how the country had changed were the pit ponies who worked in the mines with the miners. These ponies had learned their instructions, their orders by these miners who were known to be cussers. So they learned their instructions through cursing. But when the miners began to change their language and change, the pit ponies stopped reacting to them. They stopped responding to them because the miners weren't cursing at them. So they had to retrain the ponies and get new ones to train them because the miners weren't cursing anymore. The biggest shock of this revival was who is being converted. It was largely men that were being converted, and young men. They were the ones attending services and giving their hearts to God. The bars, the taverns, the theaters began to close up shop. Some of them foreclosed on because they didn't have patrons anymore. The newspapers reported that God had come to Wales. Their articles that were dedicated to sports teams and other things soon were given to the revivalists to print things about the revival. Roberts, Sidney Evans, Seth Joshua, and others led teams of young people to different parts of Wales. Roberts himself was not very old. 100,000 people came to Christ within 6 months. Now, to put this into context, according to a 1901 census, there were a little over 2 million citizens in Wales. That is 5% of the population. 5% of the Welsh population became Christians in 6 months. The flames of this revival soon began to influence other parts of the world. From England to Germany to Austria to Eastern Europe, all the way to America, the Christian world was talking about what was going on in Wales. This revival was remarkable. There was no advertisement. They didn't put posters up. They didn't tell you when you were coming. They didn't put the names of the preachers on the wall. Evan Roberts, again, didn't even preach at times. There was no planned schedule. Preaching was limited. Roberts let the Spirit lead. One person later commented this: 3/4 of the meeting consists of singing. No one uses a hymn book. No one gives out a hymn. The last person to control the meetings is in any way Mr. Evan Roberts. People pray, sing, give testimony, and exhort as the Spirit moves them. The revival was built on these 4 points. We must confess to God any known sin we have and make right any wrong done to another. We must put away any doubtful habits. We must obey the Spirit promptly. We must profess our faith publicly. They practiced these and the fruit showed. Now sadly, this revival would eventually collapse. Unlike Azusa Street, it wasn't deep schisms of doctrine that brought this revival to an end. Evan Roberts, like many evangelists and preachers before and after him, did not take very good care of himself. He would collapse while preaching to a crowd of 6,000 people in 1906. He began to have deep emotional and physical problems. He struggled from depression. Now his letters showed that he still kept his faith, but he was weakened. At this time, a woman named Jessie Penn Lewis moved in to quote-unquote help him. Jessie was an evangelist that was connected to the Keswick Convention, which I'll cover at a later date because it also is important to Pentecostalism. She had become a mentor, somewhat of a mentor, to the leaders of the Welsh Revival. She became convinced that parts of the revival, the physical manifestations like tongues and signs and wonders, were works of demonic possession. This became a rift that split parts of the Welsh Revival and its leadership. Though you may think this rift would be the thing that split them, it would not, or at least it wouldn't have a chance to. When Roberts collapsed, Jessie Penn Lewis put him on a train and took him to her house, and she and her husband took care of him while he got better. She took him far away from where he was supposed to be, far away from where the ministry in Wales was happening. She kept him sequestered from his family. None of his family or friends could see him. She was able to convince him that the physical manifestations that were going on during the revival was the work of demonic possession, and also that he was at fault for allowing it to happen. They began to work together against these moves of the Spirit. Separated from its leader, the revival began to weaken. It began to collapse. The people felt abandoned by him. He would not return to ministry as he once had, even after Jessie Penn Lewis passed away. He would die in Cardiff, in relative obscurity. Now, the Welsh Revival, even after it died out, did not stop its influence. People like Alexander Boddy, an Anglican vicar, began his ministry inspired by it, and he would reach people like Smith Wigglesworth, who would go on to be extremely influential in spreading Pentecostalism throughout the UK. Today, Pentecostalism is still alive and well in Wales. Although it's difficult to pinpoint the exact amount of people who are Pentecostal in Wales, there are 3 million Pentecostals in the UK alone. This revival, started by an untrained minister, helped to shape Wales and the world forever. The Pentecostal movement would not be what it is today without the influence of this movement. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join me again as we continue to explore Pentecostal history and doctrine. Take care.